So interestingly, PayPal was our number one ranked financial services brand up until this year. So this is actually the first year they've showed a bit of decline. And it's the first year that Amex has ranked number one correspondingly. So I'd say, up until this year, yes, PayPal was filling a niche that I think, crossed generations and gender and age and income levels more effectively than maybe some other brands. Having said that, we have seen some shifting, and this year, a general improvement across basically all credit card brands. Amex, Visa, and MasterCard have all improved their performance.
Welcome to the Tearsheet podcast. I'm Zack Miller. Rina Papler has been working in brand strategy for over 20 years. That means she's worked with many of today's top financial brands on market positioning, messaging, and their product portfolios. As a partner at Emblem, she was instrumental in creating her firm's research on brand intimacy, the emotional science that measures the bonds we form with the brands we use and love. She's applied this research to the financial industry in an effort to rank the companies and characteristics that make for today's strongest brands. Rina joins us on the podcast to discuss what makes up brand intimacy and how emotional people feel around financial services. We look at her rankings and the attributes of today's strongest financial brands. Lastly, she provides advice to companies to make themselves into more intimate brands. Rina Papler is my guest today on the Tearsheet podcast. Before we continue with our program, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Amex, for supporting Tearsheet's work. Amex is the leading data platform for banks, credit unions, and fintechs, enabling its clients and partners to easily collect, enhance, analyze, present, and act on financial data.
My name is Rina Papler. I'm a partner at Emblem, and I have been working in brand strategy for over 20 years. That means I spend a lot of time helping brands develop a unique marketplace positioning, deal with their messaging, look at rationalizing their portfolios of products or services, coming up with ideas for how to communicate across different channels and different strategies across the business. I do a lot of work in financial services. I also work in other industries like telecommunications, healthcare, and development.
Amazing. And I know one of the things you've been instrumental in creating is this like a ranking of brand intimacy for various brands. You also do it by sector. Can you define what brand intimacy is?
Absolutely. So about 10 years ago, we became really interested in kind of leveraging brands in a more effective and efficient way for today's times, given how much technology has impacted how we live and choose and read and consume information, as well as just the proliferation of brands. So through a long series of research, we came up with this idea of brand intimacy, which is really defined as the emotional science that measures the bonds we form with the brands we use and love. And the idea is kind of going back to the basics, where more and more neuroscience and behavioral science has revealed that we're really emotional, instinctive beings, and that we make a lot of decisions based on emotion. And so we're really dedicated to building brands that have a strong emotional foundation, and then leveraging that across all the channels in which brands engage today.
Well, I think one point I think would be really interesting for our audience is your perspective on how people feel. Do people feel emotional about financial services brands in general? And maybe a little explanation why or why not.
Sure. So they definitely do. And I think it's sort of easy to understand that financial services is a pretty important category, except for maybe your health. Your money is a pretty serious topic for most people. And so it's a category that has very high stakes, and that's one reason it has a strong emotional foundation. The other is simply that these are brands we tend to interact with frequently. So whether it's a credit card or a retail bank or even, an online bank, these are brands that we have occasion to frequent regularly, and that also kind of builds a stronger emotional connection. Having said that, we have found that financial services has declined over the past several years in terms of their ability to create and leverage strong emotional bonds. And so while, yes, the category is instinctively emotional, we have noticed that it is starting to decline.
91% of mobile banking users prefer using their app over going to a physical bank branch. But it's no longer enough just to offer an app. Customers demand a really good experience. That's where MX comes in. Its new mobile app, Helios, helps banks and credit unions stand out in today's world of mobile banking, going beyond simple transactions and account management. Does your mobile app get thousands of 5-star reviews? Does it increase your engagement and lead to higher brand loyalty and ROI? Check out Helios by MX at MX, that's the letters M and X.com. Interesting. And I guess looking across verticals, how do financial services firm in the brand intimacy rankings versus other industries or other companies?
Sure. So, for example, media and entertainment is our number one industry this year, whereas financial services is ranked, I think it's 9. Now it's actually lower. It's about 11. So it's declined. In our earliest studies, it was in the top 10 and even, I think, as high as 6th. And now it's sort of declined. And so brands that are lower are categories like appliances and travel. But there's a lot of other categories and industries, media and entertainment, like I said, number 1, automotive, number 2, technology, number 3. So it is a little concerning that it is on the decline.
Interesting. And what do you attribute that to? It sounds like it has been a general decline over the past 10 years since you've been doing this research. Can you put your finger on why?
Well, it's hard to say exactly. I mean, a couple of obvious things are just, things that we've all noticed. There's been a lot more communications around data breaches and hacking. There's been more concerning financial services behavior, if you will, in the news about, inappropriate handling of certain situations. And then I also think a lot of the brands in the category don't really look at building emotional bonds as a priority. They tend to be more transactional in nature and, treat customers more like a number. And so similar to the travel industry, there's, a bit of a frustration, I think, among customers in terms of how they're viewed and how their relationship is prioritized.
And so I'm looking at sort of the top players here, you've got Amex at number 1 in the industry. Before we hop into Amex, I'm interested in your perspective on what sets Amex apart. I did notice that PayPal was in the top 5, and that to me seems like one of the newer brands that has emerged versus sort of these older brands. The regular players are there, the Chases, the Visas, the MasterCards. Do you think longer term? I guess, how does brand intimacy play a role in the success of these companies? And because it's a very complicated question, do you see other brands like PayPal have the potential now to come in because of sort of the main brands lacking intimacy? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, sure. So interestingly, PayPal was our number 1 ranked financial services brand up until this year. So this is actually the first year they've showed a bit of decline, and it's the first year that Amex has ranked number 1 correspondingly. So I'd say, up until this year, yes, PayPal was filling a niche that I think, crossed generations and gender and age and income levels more effectively than maybe some other brands. Fintech is obviously a large trend, and so I think PayPal is in a good place to sort of epitomize what that is. Having said that, we have seen some shifting, and this year, a general improvement across basically all credit card brands. Amex, Visa, and MasterCard have all improved their performance, whereas some of the other players have declined, and they span retail banks and PayPal.
Interesting. And I guess, just going back to something you had said earlier in the conversation, you said, brand intimacy ranks pretty high in technology. I think of all the brands that we see there, PayPal as a brand sort of feels more like a tech company than a finance company.
Right. I think it does manage to cross that line. And the other thing that's interesting is you asked, how do people connect with financial services brands? And we have a series of what we call archetypes that were revealed and then validated through research over the years. And This is the first year that enhancement, which is really about making a consumer better connected, more enabled and smarter, is the top archetype in financial services, which also speaks, I think, to kind of technology. In the past, something like ritual, which is the frequency and becoming a habit, was the strongest archetype, as well as something like fulfillment, which is really about performance and service. So I think with the rise of enhancement in the category, it sort of does speak to the ability of a financial services brand to deliver, a full range of technology-enabled benefits to its consumers.
Interesting. I guess you talked about this sort of broad swath of credit cards moving up in the rankings across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, credit cards they kind of ride on top of banks. And in a way, the frequency and the other attributes you're describing now, like it's sort of my first interface or daily interface with my money and my spending, certainly. So it sort of keeps it top of mind. I know, just an interesting point. So let's focus on Amex. Amex was number one. Can you talk about some of the attributes that set that brand apart?
Sure. And really with Amex, it's not so much that there's any one thing that sets it apart as much as it's just doing better at a lot of the things that other financial services brands are also kind of ranking in. But for example, we mentioned enhancement being the category dominant archetype, and Amex performs extremely well in that archetype, and it improved its performance from last year. It also is able to have, let me see the exact number here, 24% of customers who use Amex consider themselves in some form of a relationship with the brand, which is also higher than we've seen in the category. So it's better at building those bonds we've talked about. 17% of Amex users said they can't live without the brand.
Wow.
Amex has also improved its overall performance since previous years. And another interesting piece for a kind of financial-oriented audience is that Amex, 13% of Amex users said they'd be willing to pay 20% more for the brand's products and services, and say Visa users would compare at 11% willing to pay more. So it's got sort of that loyalist following of people who can't live without it and are willing to pay more for it, which is, ideal for any brand.
That's interesting. And I don't know if you also track this, or we can talk about it qualitatively, but I have to imagine, credit card companies and their extensive use of rewards play a role in sort of customers feeling towards allegiance towards the brand. Does that, am I right there in that thinking?
Well, it's hard to say. We don't specifically track rewards, but yes, it has proven that rewards have been an effective way to build relationships among credit card users, and Amex, arguably, through the years, has been very well known for its rewards, and so I think that is a good guess of part of its appeal. We don't specifically ask about the rewards, but interestingly, indulgence is one of our archetypes, which is about moments of pampering and gratification. And Amex also does better than the category average in that, which could be a nod as well to its rewards. And it does better with women, interestingly. PayPal is the #1 brand with men in the category. So that's interesting. Another sort of interesting nuance this year that I was a little surprised about is financial services does better with millennials than any other age group that we test. And so typically I would think financial services is strong among, say, 45 to 65 or, over 30. But this year we found that millennials are ranking the category higher than any other age group.
I think that's one of those myths that's been perpetuated by the media, but
yeah,
it depends which studies you look at. But millennials do have strong brand allegiance in financial services.
right.
So I want to get to the most interesting part of the conversation for me is like what you have these rankings. All the companies are scatter plotted, across two axes. What would as an expert in branding, like what kind of advice do you give to financial services companies to make them more intimate?
So a couple of things, one is I always start with emotion. Are you leveraging emotion, knowing that that is how people make decisions? And so, what is the emotional kind of connection you're trying to establish with customers? And whether it's based on, assurances and confidence, or it's based on enhancement, like we talked about, the ability to make people smarter and more connected. Whatever it is, examine how you're communicating and what you're communicating. That's the first thing. The second is really being relationship focused. I know that's sort of cliche, but I think it is important. More and more financial services are looking to cross-sell or to kind of sell across a customer life cycle. And, if that's your goal, then behave like you're a relationship oriented as opposed to a, single transaction. And what that means could have implications for everything from messaging and how you talk to what you offer. I think those are obvious things. The nickel and diming, I think everybody knows, is generally a turnoff to consumers that does not seem particularly relationship focused. The other is, the channels in which you communicate. Are you everywhere your customers are? Where do you market yourself? How do you market yourself? There's lots of new kind of digital banks that are attracting millennials by having sort of salons and meeting sessions and interesting places. And I'm not saying that's appropriate for everybody, but, think about who you're targeting and think about where they would be interested in going and, find a way to ingratiate yourself into that kind of level of interaction. And so those are small things. The others are just invite dialogue. Being in a relationship means it's two-way. Today we have a lot of push, a lot of communications coming, but very little opportunity to necessarily dialogue with the brand we're in a relationship with. So make sure there's ways that consumers and customers can interact with you, whether it's in person or online or in social, or through service channels, but give people the opportunity to feel like they're in a relationship.
That's really interesting. Before we end, I'm kind of curious if you can help put this in context. Like, so we've got financial services. You talked about sort of what they're doing well and where they can improve.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give an example outside of financial services of a company that does a really good job of this? Just to kind of put things in context for us.
Let's see. Sure. I'm trying to think of one that isn't the super obvious kind, but let's go to Amazon, right? Granted, a sort of online foundation, but
Mm-hmm.
Amazon communicates in all sorts of ways, not just that your transaction has been approved, but that something's on its way. The status of something, if it's delayed, they reach out to you. You generally don't have to follow up with them. Everything is very transparent in terms of what you're receiving. Communications can happen a number of ways. You can call, you can chat, you can email. I think Amazon more and more is also looking at communicating in terms of special offers, Prime, and the way that they've built that up as a kind of members-only community, and the benefits that that offers has enabled them, to raise that price and still maintain a pretty high rate of retention. So that's just one, example. Others would be more consumer brands that are lifestyle oriented, that create communities online or tribes and are very successful at building that kind of relationship. A Harley Davidson, for example, is sort of an obvious one there.
And so where would people go to learn more about brand intimacy and sort of this year's rankings?
Sure. So you can go to emblem.com, MBLM.com, and we have a lot of information available online. We have an interactive ranking tool so anybody can see the top brands. There's a section specifically on financial services if anyone is interested. And for the brands that we've ranked in financial services, we also offer a custom dashboard to really get underneath the hood and a deep understanding of your brand's emotional strengths and weaknesses.
Great. We'll link to the report online, and we'll put that in the show notes. Rina, thank you for joining us on the Tearsheet podcast today.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.